the tabernacle in John's Gospel. It's an interesting subject. I was talking with our flatmate, Zach. I don't know if anybody knows Zach Forbes, but he's a very lively young character, and we have great discussions. And he said, why are you going to call it the tabernacle in John's Gospel? As soon as you mention the tabernacle, everybody's going to go. I said, well, what do you suggest? Shall we call it phanerosis? Maybe theophany, or the cherubim in John's Gospel? Because all of those subjects revolve around the way in which God wants to reveal himself to us. And this subject that I've looked at in the last couple of years has been born out of looking at a number of different themes in John's Gospel over many years. John is certainly my favourite book of the Bible. I always say if I could take just three books, if I was to only be able to choose three books of the Bible, for me they'd be Genesis, Isaiah and John. And I think, for me, I know those people down here that are thinking, what about the Psalms? But for me, the beauty of Genesis, Isaiah and John and the way they dovetail together is a very personal and strong passion that I have from the Gospel of John. Some of the themes that I've looked at in the past in the Gospel of John have been the feasts in John's Gospel, the absolute titles in John's Gospel, like I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world. We would see Jesus, a theme which runs quite strong through John's Gospel, developing different character studies through John's Gospel. And in all of these subjects that I've looked at, I heard echoes over and over again in and around the tabernacle. And I thought to myself, I really want to explore that more one day and spend a bit more time in the tabernacle of John as another theme to look at. I had no idea what I was venturing upon. And I decided I was going to do this study, and I'd do it for our ecclesia. We were going to run it as a Bible class through 7 studies. And so I thought, well, here's a challenge. Let's see if we can do 7 studies on the tabernacle in John's Gospel. I didn't realise where this study would go. It has changed the way I view John's Gospel completely. It's like a new book for me. And it's my belief, and I'm hoping that you'll see this by the end of the weekend, that it is the fundamental theme of John's Gospel upon which all the other themes are built. And that the thing that comes out so strong about this theme is not just the wonderful exposition that comes from it, the beautiful connections which go back to the tabernacle, which by the end of the weekend you'll see an abundance of those, but it's the overriding exhortation. There is a very powerful take-home point. And what came out of this was to identify who John's audience actually was, who his target audience was, who did he really write to, what was the message he was conveying, to whom, and when did he write it. And we're going to reveal that in our last study. So we're going to kind of put that aside in the first few studies, but at the end when we look at John's take-home point, John chapter 21, and we look at that the last of John's signs, hopefully we're going to be able to open up and show you the power behind that last sign of the catching of the 153 fish, should I say, of what John was trying to convey as a take-home point, a take-home message, and it's going to bring together the threads of the study of the tabernacle in John's Gospel. Here's our key quote. This is probably one of the most important quotes to look at when you're considering the subject. And I've got this up here from the Revised English Version, because the Revised English Version in this, by the way, this is not a readily available version in print. It's actually a very good version. You can get it online. It's a literal translation, and it really picks up the accuracy in particular in this verse, but in a number of other sections as well, of the actual Greek. So in John 1 verse 14 it says, "And the Word became flesh and lived in his tent among us." So John's Gospel starts, doesn't it? We just read, "In the beginning was the Word." And then 14 verses later, it's like the Word, the audio, suddenly becomes represented in something which is visual. It starts off with sound, and then it develops into something which is seen in sight. And the Word becomes a visual representation. The Word becomes flesh, real. And the representation of the Word is seen as a tent. Literally, that's what the Greek is. When he dwelt amongst us, it means in the Greek to pitch his tent in our midst. So there is the clear evidence right from the very outset. The prologue in John's Gospel lays out this principle of the tabernacle seen in John's Gospel. When you look through John's Gospel, there is such a strong connection back to the wilderness wanderings, more so than all the other Gospels put together. And they're not just allusions, they're direct references. Here's 12 of them just very quickly to see or to show how John is always connecting back to the events of the wilderness wanderings. The Word became flesh and tabernacled amongst us, 1 verse 14. 1 verse 17, the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. And verse 21, the Jews came to John the Baptist. "Art thou that prophet?" i.e. Deuteronomy chapter 18, the prophet that God would raise up like unto Moses. Jesus said to the Jews in John chapter 2 verse 19, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it in 3 days." And we're going to come back and look at that, but that's actually a direct reference back to the story of when the tabernacle went before them. And it says, "And the ark moved before them 3 days' journey into the wilderness to search out for them a resting place." So there was a contrast being made to the permanence of Herod's temple versus the temporary, transient nature of the tabernacle. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, John chapter 3 verse 14, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. In John chapter 5 it talks about the man who had an infirmity for how many years? 38 years. Clearly the connection's going straight back into the wilderness. In John chapter 5 verse 45, Jesus again says to the Jews, "There is one that accuses you, even Moses in whom you trust." In chapter 6 verse 32, Jesus said to the Jews again, "It's Moses gave you not that bread." And in verse 49 of the same chapter, "Your fathers did eat manna in the wilderness, and they are dead." In chapter 7 verse 19, Jesus said, "Did not Moses give you the law?" And in chapter 8 verse 5, "Moses in the law commanded us that such a one should be stoned. What do you say?" And in chapter 9, verse 29, "Thou art his disciples, but we are Moses' disciples." There's 12 direct references in John's Gospel, straight back to the comparison of Moses and the wilderness wanderings. Over and over again, the story in John's Gospel was building upon the historical events in the wilderness. Now, there were, of course, signs that were given to the children of Israel. Signs and wonders done in the land of Egypt, it says in the Psalms. There were 10 plagues which were given as signs to the nation of Egypt and to Israel. There were also signs in the wilderness for the children of Israel. There was the Red Sea, the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire, the healing of bitter waters, the manna, the quail, the water out of the rock, Moses lifting up and Hur lifting up their arms, Joshua and Hur lifting up the arms of Moses as they fought the Amalekites, Aaron's rod that budded, and of course they had immortal souls in the wilderness. In fact, it wasn't just immortal souls, by the way. There was a miracle going on. It wasn't just their shoes or their clothing. The tabernacle in itself was a miracle. It lasted some 400 years and it was made of organic material. somehow it lasted and endured through all of that. God made these certain preservatives to make all these organic materials preserve for some 400 years or more. So the tabernacle itself was a miracle. But there were 10 miracles in the wilderness, just like 10 plagues. And in fact, it seems that that's what God is saying. In Numbers chapter 14, verse 22, it says, because all of those men which have seen my glory and my miracles which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness. So he did them in Egypt and in the wilderness. 10 plagues in Egypt, 10 miracles in the wilderness, and have tempted me now these 10 times and have not hearkened unto my voice. Now, I just want to throw those connections out there because I think there's actually 10 signs in John's Gospel as opposed to the traditional 8 signs of John's Gospel. And the two that I've added in there is Jesus' baptism and Jesus' death and resurrection. They were specifically given as signs. Remember, concerning his baptism, John chapter 1 verse 32, John bare record and said, I saw the Spirit descending from heaven like a dove, and it abode upon him. And the Spirit had said to him, upon whom ye shall see the Spirit descending. And he bore witness of this. It was a sign. Down from heaven came the Spirit. John saw it, bore witness of it. Surely that was one of the signs in John's Gospel. And the other one was Jesus' death and resurrection. Because hadn't Jesus said to Nicodemus, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. He said it 3 times actually in John's Gospel, that he needed to be lifted up like Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness. In fact, we're not going to look at it tonight, but in Isaiah chapter 11, it says that he shall come, Emmanuel, and he will be an ensign to the nations, a banner. And the word for an ensign is the very same word which is used of the serpent on a pole in the wilderness. It was a sign to the people. And of course, in terms of his resurrection, didn't he say to Thomas, Thomas, put your hand in here, in here. There you go, you can see. There's the sign. It's in my side and it's in my hand. And they shall look on me whom they pierced, Zechariah, it says, and mourn for him as one mourns for an only begotten son. So his death and resurrection are detailed in John's Gospel as signs. So, in the beginning was the Word. Oh, it's a bit squashed over there. Can we move that curtain over? No? I suppose not. In the beginning was the Word. When God revealed himself to Israel for the first time, when they came out of Egypt and they came to Mount Sinai, Moses took them on this journey to go and meet God. Come out to the wilderness and meet God. And they went to Mount Sinai, and how was God first revealed to the children of Israel? Exodus chapter 19 says the word of God. God spoke to them out of the mountain, and his voice was heard like a sound of a trumpet, and the trumpet grew louder and louder and louder. Thanks, Dave. And so God was revealed to the nation, first of all, through his voice, through audio. Do you know what the children of Israel said? Stop it, we don't want to hear it anymore. They went to meet God. They went to see who this God was that called them out of Egypt, to come to know God. And when they came to the mount, they heard this booming voice and they were terrified. And they said to Moses, we don't want to talk with them, you talk with them. And so God had to reveal himself to the nation of Israel in another manner. And eventually God was going to reveal himself through the symbol of this manifestation of a place of his dwelling, the tabernacle. and the Word became flesh and tabernacled amongst them. And the symbol of how God was first presented to the nation of Israel, and then he was presented in the manifestation of the tabernacle, which is what this quote in Hebrews is all about. For you are not come unto a mount that might be touched, or that burned with fire, unto blackness and darkness and tempest, and a sound of a trumpet and a voice of words, which voice, when they heard it, they entreated that that word should not be spoken. So let's look at this quote again in relationship to Mount Sinai. It says, and the Word became flesh and lived in his tent amongst us, and we gazed upon his glory. In Exodus chapter 19 and verse 21, God said to Moses, go down and charge the people lest they break through unto the Lord and gaze upon him, and they perish. Stop them from breaking through this barrier and gazing upon the Lord and being destroyed. And this quote says, and the Word became flesh and pitched his tent amongst us, and we gazed upon his glory. We looked, all the barriers are being taken down. I just wanted to show you this quickly as an introduction. It's exactly the same theme, by the way, in his epistle to John. That which was from the beginning, and the beginning was the Word, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled the word of life. These were all the symbols of what they weren't allowed to do at Mount Sinai. They weren't allowed to look upon, they weren't allowed to touch the mountain. Might have some flat batteries. Right, just have to go into the manual operation. So, those four things, like their whole senses are now being exercised. They're permitted to gaze upon. They're not only permitted to gaze upon, they're permitted to touch, to feel, to handle. They're coming up close and personal with the glory of God in the image of Jesus Christ, in total contrast to what happened at Mount Sinai. When you go through John's Gospel, you see this theme of audio-visual all the time. And what you find is that audio always trumps visual, because in the beginning was the Word. See, John chapter 20, verse 29, Thomas, because you have seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen, yet believe. That's you and I, isn't it? We have not seen, yet we believe. These things are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that in believing you might have life through his name. So John's Gospel has another key quote that we are going to pick up again in one of our studies, which is this quote here, where Philip comes to Jesus and says, Lord, show us the Father. And Jesus' response, of course, to Philip is, he that hath seen me has seen the Father. And there was something in the presentation of Jesus. You know, when they went out to see the tabernacle, they were going to see a representation of where God dwelt. And God was manifest there. Jesus is now presenting himself as the glory of the Father on earth. You know, they say seeing is believing. But this guy, George MacDonald, I don't know who he is. He's just like, he looks really cool. So Now, he's actually a contemporary of C.S. Lewis. You know, the guy that wrote all those fantasy stories like The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe way back in his day. So he was a contemporary of C.S. Lewis and a very learned man, and he made this famous comment that seeing's not believing, it's only seeing. And isn't that true? I mean, take this little image here. What do you see when you first look at it? I hope you can see like 3 yellow dots and a green dot. Now, if you concentrate for a bit on the green dot in the middle, and just focus your eyes on the green dot, what happens to the yellow dots? They disappear, don't they? You see how you know, it all has to do with the spectrum of our mind and our peripheral vision and where our colour spectrum sits. And when you focus in, all of a sudden you lose a dimension. And there are people that saw signs and wonders, yet they died, didn't they, in the wilderness? The children of Israel saw all these signs and wonders. And John's Gospel is a book of signs and wonders, but lots of people in John's Gospel who saw these signs and wonders still did not believe. And Jesus says, except you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. In John 6 verse 30. You know, this is an interesting quote, this one. I think this is one of the most amazing quotes. What's just happened in John 6, by the way? It's just fed 5,000 people, isn't it? Like with a couple of loaves and a couple of fish. More than 5,000 people. There was 5,000 men beside women and children, so maybe 10,000 people. So he's just fed 10,000 people with a couple of loaves in it. And they come to him and say, what sign are you going to show us? Was that one not good enough? You know, you see, they were always seeking after signs and miracles and wonders. And in contrast to that is the story about the blind man in John chapter 9. Jesus said unto him, after he'd healed him, he says, you've both seen him. In context, the blind man said to Jesus, Lord, who is he that I might believe on him? And Jesus says, oh, you've seen him. But this man was born blind. He'd never seen Jesus. In fact, he'd only heard Jesus speak and tell him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. But Jesus said, you've seen him. When had he seen him? He saw him in that he heard his word and he was obedient to what Jesus said, and he did exactly what Jesus said. And when he went and washed in the pool of Siloam, he came seeing. And in John's Gospel, you've got this powerful presentation that it all starts with the word, and the audio always trumps the visual. And faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. So we said that the tabernacle theme in John's Gospel is set in contrast to that other edifice that was there in Jesus' day, that was Herod's temple. That was where the Jews believed, of course, that God was, and the centre of worship. And Jesus, of course, said to them, destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days. And as I said, that's a connection to Numbers chapter 10 verse 33, where the ark went 3 days journey before them. And this theme of Herod's temple, by the way, it's all through John's Gospel. So you can follow through the events in John's Gospel, and there's only a couple of incidents that happen, like in John chapter 4 when he goes down to Samaria, or like the feeding of the 5,000. But nearly all the other events in John's Gospel happen in Jerusalem, at the temple, in and around the temple. And you can follow that through. And you can see in John chapter 4, the woman of Samaria, she's concerned about where the place of worship is. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, but you Jews say in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. In John chapter 5, verse 14, afterwards Jesus found the man in the temple. So here was the man that was healed, and specific reference is made to the fact that Jesus went out of his way and found the man in the temple and said, behold, thou art whole, go sin no more, lest the worst thing come upon you. In John 7, verse 14, in the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the midst of the temple and taught the people. And again in verse 28, Jesus therefore cried in the temple, teaching and saying. In John chapter 8, in verse 1, early in the morning he came again into the temple. And in John chapter 10, verse 43, Jesus was walking in the temple in Solomon's porch. Over and over again in John's Gospel, you see the events that happen in the temple. And there's this contrast being made to Herod's temple. Herod's temple was a magnificent structure. Jesus had said to them, in John chapter 2 that it was 46 years in the building. And this was around AD 30. Do you know, it took another 30 years. It took 80 years to complete the building of the structure. It was finally finished in AD 63, and then it only lasted another 7 years before it was destroyed. It was an incredible edifice. It was the size of 4 football fields. I'm not sure if you'd say NRL football fields or NFL football fields, but it covered a massive span. And it was accessible by 10 gates around the temple, where only the Jews could ever enter into those 10 gates. And John's Gospel, as we said, it features all these things in and around this massive structure. It's no wonder in Luke chapter 2 that Mary and Joseph, when they went up there and Jesus was only 12 years old, that they lost him in here. There were so many people that were going up there during the time of Passover. And you kind of get a picture through this illustration of just how many people were milling around the temple during those feasts. And it gives a little bit of an impression of what it would have been like for Jesus in his day. When we come to the story of the tabernacle, that's our introduction, by the way. We're kind of doing 2 studies in one here, so sorry I was just racing along there. All I wanted to do was throw out a little bit of a theme, first of all, to show you connections to the wilderness, to show you a connection to the tabernacle, and now we're going to get into the heart of our study. So sorry if that was a little bit heavy. That was kind of like a whole study just crammed into one very quickly. What we're going to do now, or in the rest of our sessions and our study together, is we're going to see how John portrays the tabernacle, the story of the tabernacle. And remembering this, that the tabernacle is the shadow. The tabernacle is the type. And what we tend to do is we go and look at the story of the tabernacle and these different things, and then we look and see how they were fulfilled in Christ. But what we want to do this weekend is we want to do it the other way round and want to see that the type is the shadow. So we want to look and see the real, because Jesus is the real, and the real is in John's Gospel, and see the real and then go back to the shadow and look and see what God was trying to teach the nation of Israel. Because they completely missed it, by the way. They thought the tabernacle, and the Jews thought the temple institution, was all about degrees of separation of who was allowed in and who was not allowed in. And it was more about a religion of exclusion. But it was actually the opposite message that God was always trying to teach with the tabernacle. And that's what we're going to hopefully see in John's Gospel. And when you look at this, I think it's a great illustration. When you look at these grainy picture of a whole lot of apples, it's not until you suddenly add colour and dimension that it becomes obvious that something's really different. The contrast is brought out when you suddenly look at the real and you add in the colour and you add in another dimension. And when we come into John's Gospel, hopefully we're going to see the contrast teaching, because the lesson in Romans, it says, "For the law of the Spirit of the life of Christ has made us free from the law of sin and death. For what the law could not do, in that it was weak," incidentally, I don't think it was the law that was weak. It was the inability of man. It was man that was weak. Through the flesh, through the weakness of man's flesh, God sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, for sin condemned sin in the flesh. So this is the symbol of Herod's temple. And what you notice about Herod's temple is, I've got some batteries again, is that there was even here like a chamber of the lepers. There was the court of the woman. There was the chamber for the Nazarites. Obviously, when a Nazarite took a vow and they went through the process of making their offerings and serving in the temple, that was the chamber of the Nazarites. But you notice that outside was the Gentiles' courtyard. So even lepers were able to have a place in the tabernacle, but Gentiles were definitely never allowed in there. And the story of the tabernacle or the temple is all about, these degrees of separation between that which is holy right in the middle. Because, only one person ever went into the most holy, and you had to wear the right clothes, and you had to have the right pedigree. You had to be born into the right family. And there were different degrees of separation, and the further away you went, the further separated you are in these things. So what we're going to do as we look now at the tabernacle is we're going to look at the different areas. And right now we're just going to quickly look at that which was outside the courtyard. Outside. And then in our next study we're going to move in to within the courtyard. And then we're going to look at the holy place. And then we're going to look at the most holy place. And then in our last study we're going to finish with the take-home point. So in John's Gospel, there's something really interesting about the characters in John's Gospel that Jesus deals with. Have a think about them. And what do you see? This woman, John chapter 4, a whole chapter devoted to the story of this woman here. The woman of Samaria. Where did she sit? Where did she sit in that Jewish religion of things? If you look at the different degrees of separation, where did she sit? On the spectrum of the realm of close. Like the high priest is here, you're moving down to the priesthood, you're moving down to the Levites, and you're moving out to those with the court of the woman. You're going out here. Where does she sit? Way outside. She was a Samaritan, and the Jews had nothing to do with Samaritans. The Samaritans were worse than Gentiles as far as the Jews were concerned. And this woman, she had a little bit of baggage. I'm not quite sure how she would fit in many of our ecclesial, environments. How comfortable we would be. This woman that had 5 husbands, and the man that she was currently with, she was in a de facto relationship. Now, it may be that all 5 husbands had died of natural causes, but she would have been pretty much the black widow, wouldn't she? No one would have touched her with a barge pole because she goes pretty much on the extreme of the unlucky side. We're not told who the husbands were, but it would seem that she just wasn't so good with relationships. So this was a woman that had real baggage. She was so far out the spectrum of what, Jewish society in Jesus' day would have. What about this person? It would seem, this person in John chapter 5, again, a chapter dedicated to this man, it would seem that when Jesus went to the pool of Bethesda, he looked around for the worst case, didn't he? He looked around and he said, there he is, that's the one. And he went up to this man who was 38 years a cripple. Great connection back to the wilderness. We're going to look at that a little bit closer tomorrow. 38 years a cripple, and he picked the worst case. What about this man? John chapter 9. What happened to the blind and the maimed after David's day? They were never allowed to go into the temple, were they? To never enter into the temple, the blind and the maimed. But this man wasn't just blind, was he? He was born blind. It says he was born blind, and in fact it says in John chapter 9, you search the Bible, you'll never find another example of the healing of somebody that's been born blind. He was born blind. He was the worst case scenario. This, by the way, is meant to represent Mary Magdalene, there's a great chapter in John chapter 20 on Mary Magdalene. The focus comes into Mary Magdalene. Who was she? Well, she was the one out of whom was cast 7 devils. 7 devils, not one. She was the worst case scenario. 7 devils. She was completely and absolutely nutty as a fruitcake when Jesus first met this woman. A worst case scenario. What about this guy? John chapter 11, a whole chapter dedicated to this guy. How does he sit in the law? Where do dead people sit as far as the law goes? Way outside. And what about this woman? John chapter 8. How more black and white could you get? They brought to her a woman caught in the very act of adultery. Now, where does she sit? Well, they said to Jesus, open, shut case. The law says, Moses said she should be stoned. What do you say? So they brought to him an open and shut case. And the point is, all of these examples in John's Gospel are the most extreme, the most severe cases. They are outcast socially, intellectually, morally. In every sense, they are outcast from their society, and they had no hope at all of ever having an association inside where God dwelt, inside that temple area. And so what does Jesus do? He goes outside the camp. And John's focus is about going out to the worst case, and he's going to bring them in and show them his Father. So what I said we wanted to do is just show you 2 examples of those that are outside the camp. And I want to focus just briefly for a moment on this one, because I think there's a real lesson here with this story of this woman caught in the very act of adultery in John chapter 8. So have a look at John chapter 8 for a minute. Not going to go into too much detail on the story. I just want to show you the emphasis on the story of the tabernacle and those that are outside the tabernacle, because she's a great example. So it's a clear-cut case. Verse 3, the scribes and Pharisees brought before him a woman taken in the act of adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, Master, this woman was taken in the act of adultery, in the very act, and Moses in the law commanded us that such a one should be stoned, but what do you say? Now, there was all sorts of sinister things going on. This was really devious because, you know, their trap, of course, they thought they had Jesus completely trapped, because if Jesus said, no, she shouldn't be stoned, well, he's setting himself against the law of Moses. If he turned around and said, yes, well, that's what the law of Moses said, she should be stoned, so she should be stoned, what was their plan? Any idea? Exactly. What about your mother? Maybe she should be brought here as well. Remember the very night before it said, search and look, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And they went home and they searched, and throughout this chapter they make innuendos concerning the story around Jesus' birth and the scandal that Mary was found to be pregnant with child before she had been espoused to Joseph. Because they said to Jesus in verse 41, Jesus said to them, you do the deeds of your father, and they turned round to him and said, we're not born of fornication. And then again they say to him in verse 48, They then answered the Jews and said, "Say we not well, thou art a Samaritan and has a devil?" So you can see the evil in their heart. Part of this was a trap that they could have brought Mary on trial for adultery. But of course, this is an incredible story where Jesus goes on and he said, "He that is without sin cast the first stone," and they all went out from the eldest to the youngest, and he was left there with the woman, and he said, "Woman, doth no man condemn thee?" And she says, "No man." And he says, "Neither do I condemn thee." And it's a beautiful picture of Jesus. And it shows you, by the way, Jesus' authority over the law of Moses. Remember, the law of Moses was the type. So Jesus is greater than the law of Moses, and this shows it. Because the law of Moses was but a type. And Jesus says, "Neither do I condemn thee." And then he turns around in the next few verses and he starts talking about judgment. And he says in verse 15, "You judge after the flesh. You judge after the sight of your eyes. You see something and you judge, but I do not judge people." And it's one of the most powerful things that's coming out of the Gospel of John was Jesus' compassion and his love towards those which were way outside. And some of this study has been quite confronting to me. And you'll see it so strong as you go through this gospel, because I question a lot of my own views, a lot of my own prejudices towards different people. And it's been very confronting and very challenging, because Jesus says, "Well, I judge no man. But if I do judge, my judgment is true." And then it says, and this is remarkable, it says in verse 20, "These words spoke Jesus in the treasury as he sat in the temple." Now, John doesn't mix words. It's not put in there lightly. Why does he tell you that? Why is he telling you where exactly in the temple this happened? So Jesus spoke these things as he sat in the treasury in the temple. Now, why would John tell you that? Is it just, "Oh, by the way, the treasury was over there"? It's the only mention of the treasury. Why would he tell you that? So when I looked at John's Gospel, I thought, well, it has to have something to do with the tabernacle. So where was the treasury in the tabernacle? And it's only found in one place. Have a look come back to Joshua, to the story of the taking of Jericho in Joshua chapter 6. It says, when they were to overthrow Jericho, they were to destroy everything in that city. It says, but with the exception, verse 19, the silver and the gold and the vessels of brass and iron are consecrated to Yahweh, and they shall come into the treasury of Yahweh. So there's the mention of the treasury that was set up in the tabernacle, that they were to take the silver and gold and brass out of Jericho and put into the treasury. And so they did. They went in there and they took Jericho. But look what it says. Verse 24, and they burnt the city with fire and all that was therein. Only the silver and the gold and the vessels of brass and the iron they put into the treasury of the house of Yahweh, and Joshua saved Rahab. See that? In amongst the items that were taken out of Jericho and preserved, the silver, gold, the precious things, was also a harlot. She was taken out of Jericho and she was brought in to the sanctuary, into the house of God. Dedicated out of Jericho. A harlot. Now you can imagine You imagine you're in Israel, you're in amongst the tribes, and there's this discussion going on. What? They're bringing who into the camp? From where? You can imagine it, couldn't you? It would have been scandalous. They're bringing a harlot in. She's a harlot from Jericho, and they're going to bring her into the tribe of Israel and make her part of the people of Israel and her family. Imagine the scandal and the talk and the judgment. Imagine the people who would consider this and the judgmental processes that would have gone on with the people thinking about these things. And Jesus has this woman caught in the very act of adultery. And they want to kill her and stone her, like Moses said. And he said, does no man condemn thee? Neither do I condemn thee. And these things spake Jesus as he sat against the treasury. She was one that was way outside the camp, isn't she? And she's brought inside the camp and preserved as one of the vessels. So that's one of the stories outside the camp in John's Gospel. The other interesting one in John's Gospel, or another interesting one in John's Gospel, is this story. John chapter 11. The story of the raising of Lazarus. And there's an interesting parallel in the story of the raising of Lazarus. And we're just going to sort of wrap through this quickly, but it's another great story of that which is outside the camp. Because, of course, you know, a dead body, it's defiling and corrupting. Remember, you know, it's one of the key things that comes out of this story in Lazarus. Remember what Martha says? He's been dead for 4 days. His body's now stinking. It's begun the process of decomposing. It's corrupting. But the story of Lazarus is an echo to another event of that which was outside the camp. And it's the story of the red heifer in Numbers chapter 19. See, the red heifer was an unusual story. It was an event which took place which was outside the norm of things which took place. Because with the red heifer, instead of Aaron being officiating, this responsibility was given to Eleazar. Even though it was a national offering, you would think Aaron would have been the one responsible, but it wasn't. It was given. This job was given to Eleazar, and he was commissioned to officiate. Anybody know, by the way, what the Greek name for Eleazar is? Lazarus. Now, here's something interesting, isn't it? Lazarus is the Greek form of the Hebrew name Eleazar. So in John chapter 11 you get this story in and around one called Eleazar. That was one of the only times Eleazar comes to the forefront in the story of the law. And the story was this heifer was taken outside the camp to be slain before Eleazar's face. Now you imagine if you were a child in Israel and you're asking questions about what's taking place, you know, a child would turn around and say, Dad, how come they're taking that cow out of the tabernacle to kill it? Aren't the offerings meant to be inside? Aren't they killed inside and put upon the altar? What's Eleazar doing taking it outside the camp? And this animal was taken outside the camp, and then its ashes were laid up outside the camp in a clean place. So everything with this animal was outside the camp. And the ashes were used to purify from contamination of a dead body. And it was effective upon the whole nation. And it was critical that they had this. Because if not, non-purification meant death, defilement from the sanctuary. So if they didn't have a red heifer and they didn't have these ashes that they could mix and somebody could go and cleanse themselves with the ashes of a red heifer, the whole of the religious institution would have fallen down. And it begs the question, what would happen if there was no unblemished heifer? And today they say, I think the Jews believe that you can have something like 4 white hairs, and that constitutes a purebred red heifer. But if you've got 5, then it's disqualified. So they get that little picture with a guy with a magnifying glass, that's examining the red heifer to see if it qualifies to be a perfect red heifer. So it's quite an interesting story with the red heifer. And they are extremely rare. Extremely rare. But when you come to the story of Lazarus, you'll notice the emphasis of the fact that in verse 30, these things happened outside the city. And Mary went outside to meet Jesus. And then in verse 39, it says, well, his body was corrupting, and thereby it would cause contamination. But in verse 44, Jesus said, loose him and touch him, and then there was no defilement. And now you want to see the clincher of it all? Do you want to know? You want to see why John chapter 11 is the story of the red heifer? Look at the summary of John chapter 11. Verse 50. What does Caiaphas say? It is expedient that one man should die for the nation, that the nation perish not. That's the red heifer. There was one animal which died for the whole of the nation, that the nation perish not. It was totally in that symbol of the red heifer. Hence the reason it says in Hebrews, wherefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered without the gate. And the point that's being made all the way through John is that Jesus is going outside to the outcasts, to the social misfits, to those that are the most defiled, those that are burdened with sin. And he's going to reach out to those people, and he's going to bring them closer and closer and closer into a relationship with God. And he's going to bring them through, from outside, into the courtyard, through into the holy place, and ultimately right into the most holy place to meet his Father. And the story in John's Gospel is understanding that that's what God always was. God always wanted to save man. He was able to deal with people and their problems and their sins. And the biggest obstacle between us accepting or allowing God to be able to work in our lives is us. We put up these barriers. We're just like the children of Israel I know I am. Time and again. Like, we see God as so holy and pure that sometimes we sort of feel, we're just not worthy. Why would he even bother with us? But the point is, he's willing to do that. Not only is he willing, he's able to do it. So hopefully you've seen just the beginning, a bit of a taste of the Tabernacle in John's Gospel. We've looked outside the camp and dealt with 2 incidences outside the camp. In our next study, we're going to move a little bit closer in our subject of where dwellest thou, and we're going to hopefully move inside the courtyard and focus our attention on 3 things: the door into the tabernacle, the brazen altar, and the brazen laver, because that's where he deals with our sins.